In Beverly Hills, Alexander Blake, a powerful CEO, watches his 8-year-old son whisper, "Daddy, am I stupid?" The words cut deeper than any business loss. Days later, a poor boy teaching math with pebbles sparks a light in Ethan's eyes. For the first time, hope returns. But can a billionaire trust a child to teach him what no empire ever could? The chandeliers glowed softly in the Blake mansion, casting golden light over polished marble floors. Yet, Alexander Blake sat at the head of a long dining table, untouched steak cooling on his plate. He was a man admired in every boardroom in Beverly Hills. Deep blue eyes, dark hair flecked with gray, and the kind of commanding presence that could silence a room. In his navy suit and red tie, he looked every inch the powerful CEO. But tonight, power meant nothing. Across from him, his 8-year-old son Ethan sat slumped, pushing peas around his plate. The boy's shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, heavier than any stock loss Alexander had ever known. Just hours earlier, the specialists had delivered their verdict with clinical certainty. They said Ethan would struggle in traditional classrooms and might need a different approach. Words that cut deeper than any knife. Words sharper than knives. Alexander remembered sitting in that sterile office, his hands clenched, his throat burning as the experts explained that his son would never thrive in a traditional classroom. His empire of technology and education investments suddenly felt like a cruel irony. He could fund schools, build labs, change industries, yet here, with his own child, he was powerless. "Ethan," Alexander tried, his voice softer than he used in any negotiation. "Tell me what you're thinking." The boy didn't lift his gaze. His fork clattered against the china as he muttered, "They said I'll never get it." Alexander's chest tightened. He had stood on stages before thousands, never flinched in mergers worth billions, but this, his son's quiet surrender, brought him to his knees. He reached across the table, covering Ethan's small hand with his own. "Don't believe them," he whispered. "There's nothing wrong with you, son. You just learn differently." But Ethan only shrugged, his silence louder than any protest. Later that night, Alexander stood in Ethan's room, watching him sleep. The boy's face, peaceful under the glow of a nightlight, was a mirror of innocence he feared the world would crush. On the bedside table lay a small jar of pebbles Ethan sometimes played with, rolling them between his fingers when words failed him. Alexander picked one up, the cool stone resting in his palm, oddly grounding. It was nothing, just a pebble. Yet, in that moment, it seemed to hold more weight than all his wealth. He slipped it back into the jar, whispering to the darkness, "I'll find a way, Ethan, no matter what they say." But as he closed the door, Alexander knew this promise was different from any contract he had ever signed. This one carried no guarantees, no safety nets. Only the desperate love of a father afraid of losing his son, not to death, but to despair. For the first time in his life, Alexander Blake, the man who conquered industries, felt utterly powerless. And yet, deep inside, a seed of defiance stirred. If the world saw his son as hopeless, then the world was wrong. A few days later, the Rolls-Royce ghosted down Sunset Boulevard beneath a sky washed in golden afternoon light. Alexander Blake sat behind the wheel, something he rarely did anymore, insisting the driver take a break. He needed quiet, control. Ethan sat in the back seat, legs curled beneath him, forehead pressed against the cool window. He hadn't spoken much since that night. Only the sound of his breath and the occasional rattle of his pebble jar accompanied them now. They passed through familiar streets of wealth, groomed hedges, designer storefronts, doormen standing like sentinels. But as they veered near the edge of town, the sidewalks shifted. Cracked pavement, chain-link fences, faded paint on brick. It was another world, just 15 minutes away. Alexander wouldn't have driven this way if it weren't for the detour. An accident had shut down the freeway. Then came the question. So soft, Alexander nearly missed it. "Daddy." Am I stupid? His foot froze on the gas pedal. The car jerked slightly. He looked at the rearview mirror, meeting his son's reflection. What did you say? Ethan blinked at him, then looked down. They all say I'm not smart, not like the other kids. So, am I stupid? Alexander's mouth opened, but the words didn't come fast. No, he finally said, voice thick. You're not stupid. You're just different. Different means wrong, Ethan whispered. No, it doesn't. Alexander pulled over to the side of the road, hands trembling as he turned to face him fully. It means the world hasn't figured out how to catch up with you yet. Ethan didn't respond. He went back to watching the world outside, his fingers fidgeting with the jar of pebbles again. Just ahead, Alexander noticed a rusted playground fence and a group of kids huddled under a half-broken canopy beside the schoolyard. They were sitting in a circle around a boy, skinny, tan, maybe 7 or 8. He wasn't yelling or bossing them around like most kids did. Instead, he was holding out what looked like a handful of bottle caps and pebbles. Okay, the boy said loudly, a grin on his face. 3 red teams and 4 players each. So, how many total? The younger kids began to count with their fingers, laughing as they rearranged the stones into neat little rows. Ethan leaned forward in his seat. He's teaching them, he said, astonished. Alexander blinked. The skinny boy grinned again. 12. Boom! You're all soccer champs. The kids cheered. Ethan let out a small laugh. Alexander hadn't heard that sound in weeks. Can we watch? Ethan asked. Alexander hesitated. The school was clearly underfunded. Graffiti on the walls, worn-out benches, a sagging basketball hoop. Not a place he ever thought he'd pull over near. But something about the boy's energy, the way he made math feel like a game, made Alexander nod. He parked properly, turned off the engine. They sat there in silence, both watching the lesson unfold in the schoolyard. No blackboard, no tech, just a kid with pebbles and a smile. Daddy, Ethan said suddenly, his voice trembling with something like hope. I want to try. With him. Alexander looked back at his son. For the first time in months, Ethan's eyes weren't dull or downcast. They shimmered, and for Alexander, it was like seeing color return to a world gone gray. A strange feeling crept into his chest. Not quite relief, not quite fear, just the overwhelming sense that something important had just begun. All right, he said, nodding slowly. Let's come back tomorrow. And as they pulled away, the last thing Alexander saw was the boy scooping up the pebbles, placing them gently into a red lunchbox. He smiled at the younger kids as they scattered, waving like a teacher who didn't need a title. Alexander didn't know who that boy was, but something told him they were all about to learn a new way of seeing the world. The next afternoon, Alexander parked farther down the block, away from the attention his luxury car might draw. He wore no suit this time, just jeans, a dark sweater, and a baseball cap. Beside him, Ethan clutched his pebble jar like a lifeline, the lid rattling softly as they walked. The schoolyard buzzed with after-school noise. Laughter, scuffed sneakers, a teacher calling out a farewell. But near the corner fence, the same boy from yesterday sat again in a circle, this time drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Ethan hesitated behind the gate. What if he says no? Alexander knelt down, adjusting Ethan's collar. Just ask. Sometimes the smallest yes can change everything. With a deep breath, Ethan walked over. Alexander stayed behind, giving him space. Hi, Ethan said shyly, holding out his jar. Can I try the game? The boy blinked, then smiled. Sure. You got your own pebbles? Ethan nodded and knelt. I'm bad at math, he admitted, eyes lowered. Who told you that? Everyone. The boy looked at him, then at the jar. Not me. He reached out and gently spilled a few pebbles into the dirt. Okay, let's try something easy. 3 teams. Each team has 4 players. How many players in total? Ethan frowned, watching the boy place 12 stones in groups of 4. He counted softly under his breath. 1, 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Boom, the boy said, clapping. You got it. Ethan's jaw dropped. His fingers trembled. I got it? He asked, barely above a whisper. You got it, the boy grinned. See, you're not bad at math. You just needed the right field to play on. Alexander had watched the whole thing from behind the fence. His heart clenched. His son's smile, so full, so radiant, felt like a door flinging open after years of darkness. Later, as they walked back to the car, Ethan turned to him. His name's Daniel. He said I can come back tomorrow. Alexander nodded, stunned. Did you have fun? I felt smart, Ethan whispered, like my brain could breathe. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He stood in his home office, surrounded by degrees, awards, and photographs with presidents and pioneers. And none of it meant as much as that moment when his son counted 12. He poured a glass of scotch but didn't drink it. Instead, he pulled out his phone and typed a short message to his assistant. Find everything you can about a boy named Daniel, about 7 to 8 years old, lives near Grant Elementary. I want to know who he is. He stared at the message, thumb hovering, then hit send. Because what he had just witnessed wasn't luck. It was something more, something he couldn't explain, something that might change everything. The following morning, Alexander stood at the breakfast table, stirring his coffee without sipping. His phone buzzed once. His assistant's message had come through. Found him. Daniel Reyes, age 7. Lives with his mother in an apartment complex on Mariposa Drive. Father deceased. No formal teaching credentials, but teachers say he's brilliant with numbers. Self-taught. No disciplinary issues. Often helps other kids during recess. They call him Mini-Prof. Alexander let the phone rest on the granite counter. Mini-Prof. Across the room, Ethan was coloring quietly. A new energy had settled into him since yesterday. He hummed as he filled in a cartoon dog's ears with careful strokes. You want to see Daniel again today? Alexander asked. Ethan nodded without looking up. He said we could build number castles today, with the pebbles. Alexander smiled faintly. Then we'll go. Later that afternoon, he stood outside the schoolyard, arms folded, watching Ethan and Daniel seated cross-legged in the dirt. Daniel was drawing shapes in chalk, while Ethan arranged his pebbles along the edges. 4 squares with 5 pebbles each, Daniel said. What's the total? Ethan counted, lips moving, then looked up. 20? Daniel gave him a big high five. Boom! You're fast, man. From a few steps away, Alexander couldn't look away. The way Daniel taught, with play, laughter, metaphors, was unlike anything he'd seen from the PhDs and specialists he'd once paid 6 figures for. He dialed his assistant. Connor, I want you to send someone, quietly. I want to know more about Daniel's home, who his mother is, where his talents came from. Understood. Anything else? Yeah, Alexander said, voice low. Don't mention my name. That evening, his investigator called back. His mother's name is Rosa Reyes, single parent. Works nights cleaning offices downtown. Apartment is modest. 2 rooms, no father in sight. Daniel's father passed away 3 years ago. Heart condition. Name was Miguel Reyes. He used to be a teacher, math specialist at a public middle school. Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing. Anything else? Just this. Daniel's been using his dad's old flashcards, notebooks, and custom games. Apparently, Miguel built tools for students who struggled with traditional methods. His philosophy was simple. No child is stupid. They just learn in different ways. Alexander closed his eyes. That line hit hard. He thought of Ethan, of all the hours spent in glass-walled offices trying to fix what didn't need fixing, only understanding. Thank you, he said, then hung up. He walked slowly into Ethan's room. The boy was already in bed, the jar of pebbles beside him. Did you have fun today? Alexander asked. Ethan nodded. Daniel says numbers are just puzzles. You don't have to be scared of puzzles. You can solve them. Alexander smiled, smoothing Ethan's blanket. He's a good friend. The best, Ethan said sleepily. Can I go again tomorrow? Yes, Alexander said. Then after a pause added, I think Daniel's teaching me something too. As the room darkened, Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pebbles inside the jar. He'd spent his life chasing perfection, but now he was beginning to understand. It wasn't perfection his son needed. It was connection, and a boy with pebbles was teaching them both what that truly meant. The next morning, Alexander dropped Ethan off at school early, not his elite private school, but Grant Elementary, the worn-down building Daniel called home. The principal had approved a few days of community learning, intrigued by Ethan's interest and Alexander's unusually humble request. He stayed parked around the corner, watching from behind the tinted glass of his Rolls-Royce as Ethan and Daniel sat on the front steps, laughing over a set of laminated flashcards and bottle caps. Ethan looked alive. Alexander hadn't seen that spark since his wife left. He turned to his phone and opened the report again. Rosa Reyes. 2 jobs. Late husband a teacher. No assets. But what stood out most wasn't in the financials. It was a quote from a retired teacher who had once worked with Miguel Reyes. Miguel didn't just teach kids math. He taught them how to trust their minds again. Alexander leaned back, staring at the school windows. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel looked up directly at the car. His eyes locked with Alexander's through the glare of the windshield. The boy gave a little wave. Alexander smiled and waved back. That evening, curiosity turned to action. Alexander, usually hands-off when it came to anything not involving shareholders, decided to see for himself. He arrived at the Reyes apartment just before sundown. The building was tucked behind a row of dollar stores and laundromats, rusted stair rails, flickering hallway lights. He knocked gently on door 2B, holding a brown paper bag with groceries. Impulse purchase on the way over. The door opened slowly. A tired-looking woman, early 30s, stood there. Her hair was pulled into a bun, her apron smudged. Her eyes, however, were sharp. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Reyes?" Alexander asked, adjusting his tone. "I'm Alexander Blake. My son, Ethan. He's become close with your son, Daniel." She stiffened, not opening the door fully. "Yes?" "I just wanted to thank you. Your son has helped mine in ways I didn't think possible. He's teaching him, genuinely." Rosa blinked. "Daniel helps a lot of kids." "I believe that." He held out the bag. "I brought this as a thank you." She hesitated, then slowly took it. "I don't accept charity." Alexander's lips curved faintly. "It's not charity, it's gratitude." Rosa glanced behind her. Daniel's laughter echoed from inside the small apartment. "Would you like to come in?" she asked after a pause. He nodded. Inside, the apartment was simple but warm. Drawings taped to the walls, a small bookshelf stacked with children's encyclopedias, and a framed photo of a man holding a younger Daniel. Miguel Reyes. "He was a teacher?" Alexander asked, nodding toward the photo. Rosa set the groceries on the table. "A great one. He believed no child should be called hopeless. He used games, stones, stories, songs, and the kids loved him for it." Her eyes softened. Daniel was only 4 when he passed, but he remembers everything his father taught him. Alexander swallowed hard. He passed the torch. Rosa smiled, sad but proud. Yes, Daniel's been using those old tools ever since. Especially for kids like your Ethan, ones who don't fit into rows and bells. There was a silence, a deep, heavy one. Alexander broke it. "Mrs. Reyes, I want to help, not just Daniel, but expand what your husband started. Ethan isn't the only child who needs this." Rosa looked at him, cautious. "With all due respect, Mr. Blake." "Why you?" He thought for a long moment. "Because I spent a fortune trying to fix my son, when what he needed was someone to believe in him. Your son did that." "With Pebbles." Rosa exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "He'll need your promise," she said. "Not just money. That no child will be labeled broken again." Alexander nodded. "I swear it." In the next room, Daniel giggled as Ethan explained a math riddle about jelly beans. And in that tiny apartment on Mariposa Drive, something big had just begun. The next morning, Alexander stepped into his penthouse office atop Blake Innovations Tower. The city of Los Angeles sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. But for once, Alexander didn't feel like a king surveying his empire. He felt like a student. On his desk, he laid out a single item, a small cloth pouch filled with pebbles just like Daniel used. He opened it, spilled a few onto the glass tabletop, and stared. 3 groups of 4, 12. He ran his thumb over the smooth surface of a pale gray one. It had no barcode, no valuation, no quarterly return, yet it had cracked open his son's world. Just then, his assistant Connor stepped in. "Sir, the board is asking if you're joining the Education Investment Summit today. Your keynote—" "Cancel it," Alexander interrupted. "I'll be occupied." Connor blinked. "Do you want me to reschedule the panel? They're expecting your vision for next-gen AI tutoring models." "No," Alexander said firmly. "I found a different kind of model." He picked up one of the pebbles, held it between finger and thumb. "Connor, how fast could we assemble a small team? Designers, curriculum experts, developers?" Connor tilted his head. "What's the scope?" "We're going to build something new. A teaching framework based on Daniel Reyes's methods. Games, stories, physical learning tools." There was a pause. "And Daniel is?" "A 7-year-old, Alexander said calmly. "But possibly the best educator I've ever seen." Connor gave a slow nod, masking confusion. "Right. I'll start discreetly pulling names." Alexander turned to face the skyline again, voice softer now. "And Connor, make sure none of this looks like a PR stunt. If this works, it's because it's real. No press, no buzz, not yet." That evening, back at Grant Elementary, Ethan and Daniel sat at their usual spot under the magnolia tree, giggling over an addition race involving colored chalk and hopscotch. Alexander watched from a distance, his heart fuller than any boardroom victory had ever left it. Later, as the sun dipped behind the school, Alexander walked over to the boys with 2 cold lemonades in hand. "Coach Daniel," he said warmly, handing the boy one. "You've got quite the classroom here." Daniel laughed. "Way more fun than sitting inside." Alexander crouched beside them. "How would you feel about helping other kids too? Ones like Ethan, who've been told they're not smart enough, fast enough." Daniel paused, thoughtful. "Like, as a job?" Alexander nodded. "More like a mission." Daniel glanced at Ethan, who grinned. "We'd be like brain ninjas." Alexander chuckled. "Exactly." Daniel grew quiet. "Only if we do it like my dad did, with stories and kindness, no yelling, no tests." "No one will ever yell," Alexander said, "and no one will ever be called hopeless." Daniel's face lit up, and for a moment he didn't look like a kid from a poor neighborhood. He looked like a leader. "We could call it Project Pebble," Ethan said excitedly, "because it started with stones." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, Project Pebble." Alexander looked between them, then up at the chalkboard sky. 2 boys, 1 dream, 1 truth. Children aren't broken. Systems are. And now they were going to change that, 1 pebble at a time. By the end of the week, Alexander's sleek Beverly Hills mansion was filled with something it hadn't known in years. Laughter. Not from guests or parties, but from Ethan and Daniel, sprawled across the living room floor surrounded by index cards, Legos, and chalk markers. "They're building a math game," Alexander explained to Rosa, who stood cautiously at the edge of the plush rug holding a cup of tea he'd insisted she accept. "In your house?" she asked, glancing around at the cathedral ceilings and imported lighting. "In our house," he replied gently. "As long as they need space, they're welcome here." Rosa watched as Ethan held up a cardboard sign. 12 warriors versus 3 dragons. Who wins? Daniel corrected the spelling, but they both giggled like it didn't matter. "I never thought—" Rosa began, but stopped. Alexander finished for her. "That a CEO would listen to a 7-year-old? Rosa looked at him. "That anyone would listen to a janitor's son and a boy they once labeled unteachable." Alexander nodded, then said quietly, "They were wrong." Later that night, as Daniel and Rosa left for home, Alexander found Ethan in the study, holding one of the pebbles from his jar. "Daddy," he said, "do you think I could help other kids too?" Alexander's voice caught. "I think you already are." But, even with the joy, guilt still haunted him. He stood alone in his office hours later, staring at his reflection in the glass, his phone glowing in his palm. On the screen were invoices. Every expert, every specialist he'd paid to tell him what Ethan couldn't do, and not one had seen the boy who built kingdoms with pebbles. He closed the screen and sat heavily in his chair, elbows on the desk, forehead in his hands. Why didn't I believe in him? The next morning, he called Rosa. "I want to show you something," he said. "Please come with Daniel. It's important." The car rolled slowly through East Los Angeles, where the city's Polish gave way to cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. They stopped in front of a dilapidated community center, boarded windows, faded paint, a forgotten place. Alexander stepped out, Rosa and Daniel beside him. "This," he said, "was one of the first buildings I ever invested in. It failed." "Why bring us here?" Rosa asked. "Because I want to rebuild it. With you, with Daniel. Not as a center for profit, but as a place where kids like Ethan and Daniel can learn freely." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Like a giant classroom?" "Exactly," Alexander said. "A lab, a playground, a school where games are lessons and no one gets labeled." Rosa's hand pressed to her chest. "And what do you want in return?" Alexander shook his head. "Only that it works. Only that it reaches the kids who've been forgotten." Daniel picked up a pebble from the ground. Gray, dusty, ordinary. Then he smiled. "Let's build it." And, for the first time in his life, Alexander Blake, billionaire CEO, master of the deal, felt like he was finally doing something that mattered. Not for investors, not for headlines, but for his son, and for every child who ever heard the word hopeless. The next few weeks moved faster than any merger Alexander had ever overseen. Architects drafted blueprints for the new center. Developers began building a custom platform based on Daniel's playful methods. Curriculum specialists, skeptics at first, found themselves charmed by the simplicity of stones, stories, and sidewalk chalk. And through it all, Daniel and Ethan were at the center. 2 boys sitting cross-legged in boardrooms, testing math games while adults scribbled furious notes. Alexander walked into one such meeting late on a Thursday, wearing no tie for the first time anyone at Blake Innovations could remember. He found Ethan explaining a game about fractions using sliced pizza magnets. "This is the pepperoni one," Ethan said seriously. "But you only get half if you answer wrong." The room erupted in warm laughter, even from Rosa, seated beside a developer who had worked on multi-million-dollar AI tutors. After the meeting, Rosa pulled Alexander aside. "Are you sure this is how you want your name to be known? You're a titan of tech. Now you're betting your legacy on bottle caps and sidewalk games." Alexander's gaze followed the boys, now drawing patterns on a whiteboard with colored markers. "I've spent years being respected," he said softly. "I'd rather be remembered." Rosa's expression softened. "Miguel used to say that too." That night, Alexander returned home late. He poured himself a glass of water and wandered to Ethan's room. The boy was asleep, one arm around his pebble jar, face peaceful in a way Alexander hadn't seen in years. He sat beside the bed and whispered, "I'm proud of you." The next morning brought a different kind of challenge. A journalist from a major outlet had caught wind of the strange new initiative, Project Pebble, led by a tech mogul and a child advisor. The headline read, "Has the CEO of Blake Innovations lost his edge? Why Alexander Blake is now taking career advice from a 7-year-old." Alexander tossed the paper onto the kitchen counter and rubbed his forehead. Connor was already buzzing his phone. "Should we issue a statement? Push back? Schedule an op-ed?" "No," Alexander said firmly. "We're not defending anything. We're building." Connor hesitated. "Sir, investors are calling. They want to know if you're mentally—" "I'm fine," Alexander snapped. Then calmer, "Better than fine." That afternoon, Alexander met Rosa and Daniel at the construction site. The old community center had been gutted. New beams, fresh insulation, even the scent of pine filled the air. Daniel ran inside and stood under the frame of what would become the learning garden, an outdoor space filled with chalk walls, movable number blocks, and pebble pits. He turned to Alexander, grinning wide. "Can we make a pebble museum too? Like with a glass box?" Alexander laughed. "What would you put in it?" Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out one small, scratched stone, the very one he'd used when Ethan said 12 for the first time. "This one. It started everything." Alexander stared at the stone, throat tightening. "That pebble," he said, "is worth more than any IPO I've launched." That evening, back in the study, Ethan brought Alexander a drawing. It showed 3 figures, a boy with glasses, a boy with a jar, and a tall man in a red tie, all standing beside a chalkboard that said, "No child is broken, just waiting for the right key." Alexander knelt, tears brimming. "Did you draw this?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "It's for the school. You can hang it up." Alexander hugged him close, whispering into his hair, "You're the bravest boy I know." And as the night deepened, Alexander knew they weren't just building a center. They were building a new way forward. By the time fall settled over Los Angeles, the community center, now officially renamed the Pebble Learning Lab, was nearly complete. Colorful murals covered the exterior walls, each one designed by local kids, including Ethan and Daniel. Inside, the rooms weren't arranged by grade, but by curiosity. There was a story math room, a puzzle playground, and a no mistakes just clues corner where even wrong answers earned high fives. But as the paint dried and programs launched quietly in small pilot groups, a storm began to gather in the press. First came the viral blog post. Billionaire CEO risks child's education for DIY learning experiments. Then the late-night monologues. Alexander Blake, the guy who used to invest in satellites, is now investing in rocks? Then came the whispers in boardrooms and coffee shops. Is he losing it? Trading tech for finger paints? Alexander sat in his home office one night, staring at the headlines. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from a major investor. He let it go to voicemail. Down the hall, Ethan's laughter rang out as he and Daniel watched a science video in their pajamas. Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. The criticism stung, but the sound of his son laughing in the next room mattered more. He stood and walked into the living room, where Rosa was cleaning up a tray of empty juice boxes. "They're not going to stop," she said softly. "I know. You could stop it. A press tour, some polished numbers. Say you're just testing new markets." Alexander looked toward the hallway. "I'm not trying to impress shareholders anymore. I'm trying to change lives." Rosa studied him for a moment. "You sound like Miguel." He turned to her. "Tell me something. Why did Miguel keep going? Even with no funding, no recognition?" She smiled. "Because every time a child lit up with understanding, it was worth more than any paycheck." Alexander nodded slowly. "Then I'm on the right path." But the real test came one Monday afternoon. Ethan and Daniel had just wrapped up a game-based math session when a sharply dressed man in a suit approached them in the learning lab's hallway. His voice was clipped, confident, the kind Alexander knew well from years of boardroom warfare. "Excuse me," the man said. "Are you the boys behind Project Pebble?" Daniel stood protectively in front of Ethan. "Yes, sir." "I'm with the Education Standards Alliance. We'd like to understand your methods." Alexander stepped in just then, his presence commanding as ever. "You're speaking to the founders." The man's brow lifted. "Founders?" "Yes," Alexander said firmly. "This is Daniel Reyes and my son, Ethan Blake. They're the reason this exists." The man gave a tight smile. "We're concerned. What kind of metrics are you using? Accreditation? Standard testing models?" "We're using something simple," Alexander said evenly. "Joy. Kids who once cried over homework now run to class early because they want to learn." The man didn't laugh. "That won't convince legislators or donors." Alexander stepped closer. "I'm not asking them. I'm showing them." Daniel, still holding Ethan's hand, looked up. "Can I show you how I taught Ethan multiplication?" The man blinked. "You want to demonstrate?" Ethan nodded. "With pebbles?" Reluctantly, the man agreed. In the next 5 minutes, Daniel led him through a storytelling game involving knights, treasure, and multiplying sword groups. By the end, the man's skepticism had thinned. Alexander watched him go, his stride slower than when he arrived. He turned to Daniel and Ethan, who were now laughing over a joke about dragons and division. "You two just won your first policy debate," he said with a smile. Daniel grinned. "What's a policy debate?" Alexander ruffled his hair. "Exactly. In a world that worshipped numbers, they were teaching meaning. And for once, the world was starting to notice." 2 weeks later, the first official visitors walked through the doors of the Pebble Learning Lab. Not journalists or investors, but children. Lots of them. Kids from overcrowded schools, underfunded programs, and families with no access to private tutors. Word had spread, and with it, a quiet hope. Alexander stood by the front window, watching the line of parents stretch down the sidewalk. Rosa stood beside him, arms folded tightly, eyes wet with disbelief. "They're not here because of marketing," she whispered. "They're here because of faith." Inside, Daniel greeted each new student with a bucket of pebbles and a question. "Want to play a number story?" Ethan passed out sketch pads with riddles printed inside. The first day, 30 kids came. By the end of the week, they had 110. In the evenings, Ethan and Daniel would collapse on the couch, their faces smudged with chalk, their voices raspy from laughter. And in those quiet hours, Alexander saw something more profound than success. He saw healing, but not everyone was celebrating. In a late-night call with his board of directors, Alexander faced a screen full of furrowed brows. "You've diverted nearly $2 million in company funds," one member barked, "into a side project with no proven ROI. You've compromised our tech roadmap," another added. "Investors are nervous. We're losing confidence." Alexander sat calmly at the head of the table. "This isn't a side project," he said. "It's the future of education. We spend billions building platforms that personalize learning, but most of them still expect kids to conform to a system built 100 years ago." One executive leaned forward. "You're seriously putting faith in methods developed by a 7-year-old? Alexander didn't flinch. "I'm putting faith in what works. If you want to vote me out, go ahead. But you'll have to explain to the public why you turned your back on children." Silence. He ended the call himself. Later that night, he sat on the back porch with Rosa. "They'll try to take it," he said. "The control, the credit, maybe even the funding." Rosa looked up at the stars. "Then make it bigger than them." He turned to her. "How?" "Give it away." So he did. The following Monday, Alexander stood in front of a group of parents, teachers, and kids. No cameras, no spotlights. Just folding chairs in a sunlit courtyard. He held up a glass display case. Inside sat 3 small pebbles, weathered, plain, powerful. "These stones," he said, "helped my son believe in himself. They did what no amount of money, therapy, or software ever could." He paused, voice catching slightly. "I was told my son was hopeless, that he'd never learn. But it wasn't him who failed. It was the system." He turned toward Daniel, seated proudly beside Ethan. "This boy," Alexander continued, "taught me how wrong that thinking is. And now we want to teach the world." He stepped back and gestured toward the crowd. "Today, we're launching the Pebble Initiative as a nonprofit. Open-source tools, free learning kits, public workshops, no gatekeeping, no paywall. Just pebbles, stories, and the belief that no child is broken." The crowd erupted in applause. Daniel whispered to Ethan, "Did I do okay?" Ethan grinned. "You crushed it." Alexander looked out at the sea of faces, some joyful, some tearful, and realized he wasn't just building a new program. He was building a movement, one stone at a time. The following days brought something Alexander never expected. Not more criticism, not investor panic, but letters. Hundreds of them. Some handwritten, some typed in shaky fonts. From parents, teachers, even children. From Iowa to New York. From places where schools had no resources, where kids had been held back or called lazy for struggling to read a clock or memorize equations. "My son cried less during math homework this week. We tried the Pebble game. My daughter got multiplication for the first time. I thought my students weren't listening. Maybe I just wasn't teaching their language." Alexander kept them all. Every letter. He placed them in a binder labeled Proof, not for the board, not for the press, but for himself. On a quiet Sunday morning, he took Ethan and Daniel to the learning lab before anyone else arrived. The sun poured in through the skylight. The boys ran to their favorite table, now known as the Idea Station. Alexander set the glass case of pebbles on the center shelf beneath a hand-painted sign. "Every mind counts." He called them over. "I want to show you something." Ethan peered at the display. "Those are the pebbles from the first time, right?" Alexander nodded. "These stones reminded me what learning really means, what love means." Daniel stepped forward, eyes wide. "They're like a treasure." "They are," Alexander said, his voice low. "They saved a father. They built a school. And now they'll help kids forever." Daniel's fingers brushed the glass. "Do you think my dad would have liked this?" Alexander knelt to eye level. "He would have been proud. Of the teacher you are, of the boy you still get to be." Daniel looked down. "Sometimes I miss him so much it hurts." Alexander gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "That means he's still with you, not gone, just woven into everything you're doing." Ethan reached for Daniel's hand and squeezed it. He'd be cheering the loudest. The moment held, quiet and full. Then Daniel grinned. "Okay. Time to build a dragon game about decimals." And they were off. Pebbles flying, chalk dust rising, laughter bouncing off the walls. But while the lab was full of joy, the outside world continued to question. A prominent news station aired a special, "Can a child really lead a revolution in education?" They interviewed professors, skeptics, analysts, but they also interviewed parents. One mother, in tears, said, "My son was going to be held back. Now, he asks to stay late at school." Another teacher shared, "I had one student who never spoke. Now she's leading group puzzles because she finally feels seen." When the piece aired, Project Pebble's website crashed from traffic, and suddenly the board stopped calling. Instead, foundations reached out. Universities asked to collaborate. Families donated, not money, but stories, time, belief. And late one night, Alexander stood alone in the learning lab, turning the lights off room by room. He paused at the pebble display. He thought of who he was before all this, a man with power, yes, but no peace. Now, he had neither silence nor certainty, but he had meaning. He whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Ethan." Two boys who taught the world's most powerful man how to listen, and in doing so, changed everything. Weeks later, the Learning Lab hosted its first Family Day, a community open house where parents, siblings, and neighbors could join in the games, lessons, and chaos of joyful learning. The parking lot overflowed. Fold-out tables were covered with jelly bean math games, sidewalk tiles with division mazes, and a mural wall where kids painted their answers to the question, "What does learning feel like?" One girl wrote, "It feels like I'm flying." Another drew a brain with flowers growing from it. Alexander stood beside Rosa, both watching Daniel guide a group of younger kids through a fraction adventure quest. "You know," Rosa said, brushing dust off her jeans, "Miguel used to dream of this kind of day." Alexander smiled. "Then let's make sure this is just the first of many." From across the courtyard, Ethan ran toward them, face flushed with excitement. "Daddy," he called, "there's a boy named Oliver. He said he hates school, but now he's laughing. He wants to come every day." Alexander bent down. "And why do you think that is?" Ethan beamed. "Because Daniel showed him how to play learning." Just then, Daniel arrived too, panting. "And we told him that being slow doesn't mean being dumb." Alexander's throat tightened. He glanced at Rosa, whose eyes were shining. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned, a quiet ceremony began in the courtyard. Daniel stood nervously beside a small wooden easel, a cloth draped over it. Ethan held a framed sketch. Alexander stepped up to the microphone, his voice calm but emotional. "Today," he began, "we honor someone who never saw this place, but who planted its seeds long ago." He turned toward Daniel. Miguel Reyes believed that every child was a spark waiting to be seen. When others dismissed the struggling, he leaned in. When systems said not enough, he answered, "Try another way." Alexander then nodded to Ethan, who revealed the drawing, 3 pebbles under a banner that read, "The teacher who taught the world to listen." Rosa gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel stepped forward and slowly pulled the cloth off the easel. It was a plaque, simple and elegant. The Miguel Reyes Learning Garden, built from love, laughter, and stones that spoke louder than tests. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Daniel whispered, "I think he'd say thank you." Alexander knelt beside him. "I think he already has." That night, as twilight deepened and volunteers cleaned up, Alexander sat on the bench near the garden. Ethan crawled onto his lap. "Daddy," he murmured, "do you remember when I asked if I was stupid?" Alexander's jaw clenched. "I remember." Ethan looked up at him. "I don't feel that way anymore." Alexander couldn't speak. He simply held his son tighter, forehead resting against Ethan's, and in that quiet, under the string lights swaying gently above them, he made a promise, not out loud, but deep in his bones. No child would ever be called hopeless again, not while he still had breath to give. The auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, policymakers, and media filled every seat, some standing in the back. The stage bore no banners, no corporate logos, just a single glass case resting on a pedestal. Inside it, 3 small pebbles. Alexander stood behind the podium in his navy blue suit, red tie slightly loosened, eyes scanning the crowd. Ethan and Daniel sat in the front row beside Rosa, hands folded, legs swinging. This was no product launch, it was something far greater. "My name is Alexander Blake," he began, voice clear but steady with emotion. "And I've built a lot of things in my life, companies, technologies, campuses, but none of them matter more than what I'm sharing today." He paused, then nodded toward the display case. "These are pebbles, just pebbles, the kind you'd kick down the street without a second thought. But they taught my son to believe again. They helped a 7-year-old boy named Daniel reach a kid no one else could. They became the foundation of what we now call the Pebble Initiative. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. This, he unfolded it slowly, was the report from the psychologist who called my son unteachable, hopeless, broken. Gasps rippled across the room. I kept it for a long time, as a reminder of how wrong even the smartest people can be when they stop listening. He held up the paper, then calmly tore it in half. Then again. Applause burst from the audience. Alexander continued, voice rising with quiet passion. We launched Pebble, not as a school, but as a movement. One that believes learning isn't about speed, it's about connection. That every child has a voice, a rhythm, a way of understanding the world. And when we match that rhythm, instead of silencing it, incredible things happen. He turned toward the boys in the front row. I learned this not from a research paper, not from a think tank, but from my son and from his best teacher. Ethan smiled wide. Daniel turned bright red. Alexander looked back at the crowd. I've been called crazy, reckless, even foolish. But if foolish means choosing a child's voice over a test score, then I'll wear that label with pride. He stepped aside as a massive screen behind him flickered on. Video clips played. Kids solving puzzles with laughter, drawing math with chalk, telling number stories like fairy tales. Alexander turned back one last time. These stones taught one child to believe. Imagine what they can do for 1,000,000. The room erupted. Not with the sterile claps of boardrooms, but with something warmer, louder, real. Later that evening, back at the learning lab, Daniel wandered into the quiet garden and found Alexander there alone, staring at the stars. Hey, Daniel said softly. Alexander turned. Couldn't sleep? Daniel shrugged. I was just thinking about my dad. He never got to see this. Alexander nodded. I think about that too. Daniel pulled something from his pocket, a small pebble, darker than the others. I saved this one, he said. It was from the day I first played math with Ethan. Alexander took it gently. May I? He added the stone to the glass case. It clicked gently against the others. Then he looked at Daniel and said, You changed my life. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. You gave me a place to share what my dad gave me. They stood in silence for a long moment as the wind moved through the trees, and the world, somehow, felt just a little lighter. Months passed. Autumn leaves gave way to rain-soaked sidewalks and the soft hush of California's winter. But inside the learning lab, warmth bloomed every day. Children arrived in layers, hoodies, patched coats, laughter in their footsteps. Some came shy, trailing behind parents. Others burst in, shouting ideas before the door even closed. The hopeless ones, as a journalist once mockingly called them, were now writing books of their own, books filled with color, pebbles, riddles, and joy. Alexander stood near the entrance one morning, coffee in hand, watching Ethan and Daniel lead a new group through the number maze. A girl in a wheelchair was giggling as Daniel handed her a chalkboard and whispered, No pressure, just play. Rosa stepped beside him. You ever think how different this could have turned out? He nodded. Every day. She smiled. You never told me why you really believed in Daniel. Alexander looked toward the glass display case in the corner. Because when everyone else gave me facts, he gave me proof. He didn't try to fix my son. He saw him. He took a deep breath. I used to think power was the ability to control outcomes. Now I know it's the ability to listen. At the year-end celebration, parents filled the learning lab again. Kids gave speeches. One boy wrote a poem about subtraction. Another performed a rap battle between decimals and fractions. Daniel and Ethan stood together on stage, holding hands, their cheeks pink with pride. Alexander stepped up, the last to speak. But instead of a speech, he held up a framed certificate. On it was one word, believed. He turned toward Daniel. This is for you, for showing the world that teaching doesn't require credentials, it requires heart. He knelt, presenting it to Daniel as the crowd stood in ovation. The boy's lips quivered. He whispered, "Thank you." Alexander whispered back, "No, thank you." Later that night, back at home, Alexander tucked Ethan into bed. The boy's room looked different now, no longer sterile or colorless. It was filled with books, game cards, pebble sets, and hand-drawn maps of number worlds. As Alexander turned to leave, Ethan called softly, "Daddy?" He stopped. "Yeah, Bud?" Ethan sat up. "Remember when I asked you if I was stupid?" Alexander turned around fully. His voice was gentle. "I remember." Ethan smiled. "I don't think that anymore." Alexander walked over, knelt beside the bed, and kissed his son's forehead. "I never did." They didn't say anything else. No grand speech, no final lesson, just a boy who had found his voice and a father who had finally learned to hear it. Outside, in the quiet of the night, the moonlight reflected off the glass pebble case in the learning lab's window. Inside it, 5 stones now, each one a story, each one a spark, and beneath them a small plaque read, "No child is hopeless. Some are just waiting to be seen." The world kept spinning. But in this corner of Beverly Hills, one CEO, one little boy, and one lost stone had rewritten the rules forever.